Education in the Progressive Era, a project by Michelle Hartley, Shelley Estes, and Jeline Galley. If we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, we rob them of tomorrow. A quote by John Dewey. The period of time in American history between the 1880s and the 1920s was called the Progressive Era. It was a time of incredible restructuring, development, and reforms. Before we can have a comprehensive discussion about the Progressive Era, we must first talk about what led us there, the Gilded Age. Coming into the 1890s, America had some huge challenges. The Gilded Age was just that, gilded, a term coined by Mark Twain. America may have looked beautiful and shiny from a distance, but with the great wealth that was being built was done on the backs of poverty-stricken Americans, child laborers, and poor immigrants. Rising out of the Civil War and Reconstruction aftermath came the great robber barons, aka the titans or captains of industry, like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, J. Pierpont Morgan, and John D. Rockefeller. They led a massive industrial revolution. Their means of growing their great fortunes did have some positive impact on our country through philanthropy, improved workforce productivity, increased jobs, and bigger markets. Unfortunately, they often used political corruption and incredibly poor treatment of workers to achieve their goals. These are a few of those titans of industry. You'll recognize their names as they are still very well known to this day. In this time, child labor laws did not exist. People often depended on the wages of their children to survive. According to an article at ushistory.org, in 1870, about half of the nation's children received no formal education whatsoever, although many states provided for a free education for children between the ages of 5 and 21. Economic realities kept many children working in mines, factories, or on the farm. Only 6 states had compulsory education laws at this point, and most were for only several weeks per year. School was not required beyond the age of 10 years old. Historian Robert Weeb described it as a search for order. There are many challenges to overcome, such as the residual effects of weak and corrupt political leaders and general unbalance in all areas of life. Reformers wanted change. Some of the targets for reformers were the rampant political corruption, problems caused by immigration, urbanization challenges, industrial monopolies, labor reform, gender inequality and women's suffrage, and public education. The people of the era that were seeking reforms came from all walks of life and included Republicans, Democrats, teachers, and journalists who saw a need to balance out unfair and unjust things that were happening in our country. At the end of the Gilded Age, public education was still operated very loosely and was not valued by the majority of the population. Schools and colleges across the country were increasing. However, a boy's education was still of far greater importance than a girl's. Girls were often taught only household, wifely skills. According to Howard Zinn in A People's History of the United States, the primary purpose of public education during the Gilded Age was to train skilled and semi-skilled workers for the new age of industrialism. African Americans struggled not only to deal with segregation in schools, but also with finding a place to learn at all. More and more people began to indulge in and approve of the idea of tax-supported education. The school system remained largely private and unorganized until the 1840s. Education reformers such as Horace Mann had already began calling for public education systems for all, and people were beginning to listen. The environment must be rich in motives, which lend interest to activity and invite the child to conduct his own experiences. A quote by Dr. Maria Montessori. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. A quote by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Many European philosophers influenced the philosophies of education here in the U.S. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Johann Henrik Pestalozzi, and Frederick Froebel were admired, as were their philosophies. Rousseau believed in a return to natural development stages without influence from social institutions. He was the father of the progressive movement's social contract, where students chose what and when they learn. He believed in emotional, intellectual, and educational freedom for all students. Pestalozzi believed that education for all would improve society. He believed that the mind is always active, that it was perceiving, analyzing, selecting, and observing. Froebel is the father of early childhood education, or kindergarten. Froebel influenced Montessori school founder Maria Montessori, as well as John Dewey, one of the most important educational philosophers in the United States. American Herbartianism began in 1890. Johann F. Herbart was responsible for a revolution in education. Lockstep was based on 5 steps: preparation, presentation, association, generalization, and application. The new progressive agenda felt that this method did not respect individuality, creativity, or new ideas. John Dewey fostered the growth of the progressive education movement. Progressive education continued to grow and expand from 1919 to its height in 1930. The Progressive Education Association was formed in Washington, D.C. on March 15, 1919, with 85 charter members. Charles W. Eliot was the association's first honorary president, and membership came from experimental and private school members. Education is not an affair of telling and being told, but an active and constructive process, a quote by John Dewey. John Dewey had a PhD in philosophy and spent his last years at Columbia University and the Teachers College. John Dewey's educational theory believed that learning grows out of meaningful activity. He developed a scientific method of application that is still used today, where he believed that activity would sometimes lead a child to a problem, which would then cause the student to find data, create a hypothesis, test it, and find a result. He was a leader of the progressive movement. Many of his principles were adopted in the mission statement of the movement. According to History of Education in America, 7 basic principles were adopted by the association. Students have a democratic education, no longer passive, but active participants in their learning. A student must have interest in work. The teacher only guides the students. Scientific study is important in development. Look at the development of the whole child, paying attention to the effects of the child. A child's life is not solely school. Home life is of equal importance. Progressives led in thought and perpetuate forefront of the movement. To understand education is to understand a nation. Dewey's contributions included his books, The School and Society, and Democracy in Education, and they are foundational in the progressive era's educational theories. Experimental laboratory schools set up around the University of Chicago. Francis W. Parker, following the mission of the progressive education, believed in the moral, physical, and mental development of future democratic leaders and citizens. Ella Flagg Young, president of the National Education Association in 1910, a major reformer, believed in school governing bodies that met with teachers and administrators to discuss curriculum and logistics, thus creating the first school-level principals and deans to counsel students. Progressive's goal was to reform the American education system. Please see the link in the description of this video below. The progressive era is summarized nicely by this YouTube video created to promote the progressive education and its implied theories. Unfortunately, the Cold War brought back patriotism, traditional and conservative ideals. The race for space against the Russians turned the tide back to elite education steeped in math and science. The progressives and their attempts to educate for the people and the social change declined as the wheel was reinvented yet again. Most schools were still one room where the youngest sat in the front and the older kids sat in the back. With one-room schools, they did not have a way to make lunches. Therefore, families had to send lunch in pails, which was hard for those who couldn't afford it. With the country pushing for more kids in school instead of working, they had the needed supplies: books, desks, chalk, and slabs to write on. In later years, they started being able to use ink pens and paper, mainly to practice good penmanship. African American children were still put in separate schools. Sometimes it was combined with Sunday school in churches, as some counties did not want to put money into a school just for them. As more people leaned toward the more active learning that Froebel and Pestalozzi introduced, it took time for teachers and schools to afford new, hands-on learning activities. Some would find ways to use their surroundings to supplement with their lessons, or even continue to teach home skills that were still being pushed on children and turn it into a fun activity. Schools were often built to serve smaller communities, so they did not find the need to help transport students. Therefore, the students had to walk to school. If they lived in the country, they either did not attend or their parents had to hire teachers to come to their house. Some teachers would collect their students on their way to school. From the American Education History Hypertext Timeline, it wasn't until 1919 that states passed laws requiring transportation for students to get to school. History.com recalls that on January 12, 1888, a huge storm, referred to as the school children's blizzard, hit the northwest plains around 2 p.m., dropping temperatures 100 degrees. Due to severe conditions, many couldn't see. Some teachers kept their students in the school for safety as long as they could. Others tried to get to a safer location using ropes to guide them. Sadly, over 200 people died in the storm. While the majority of the country agreed that students needed an education, they still only taught to the 8th grade, where they had to pass a rigorous test in order to graduate. According to an article found on Mental Floss, school years were also shorter, closer to 130 days instead of 180, so that the children could still help their families at home most of the year. Many schools used the monitorial method, which is where the older students would be asked to teach the younger students lessons while the teacher monitored them. This is mostly due to the fact that one teacher had to cover a wide range of ages in a single class. While there were schools being built for deaf, blind, and mute students, it was usually because the community members felt that they were a burden on them as they couldn't do everything on their own. Most schools for the deaf, mute, and visually impaired were called asylums or institutions, and students were sometimes treated like they had a problem and were not treated kindly. Oftentimes, the schools these children were put into were old, worn-down buildings. Deaf children were forced by teachers, doctors, and parents to learn what's called the oralist method, where they had to read lips and voice words instead of using sign language. While they felt it would help them blend into society more, the children felt like they were being told they were outcasts. After the National Association for the Deaf was founded in 1880, more people advocated for American Sign Language to be taught in schools for the deaf. We can be thankful for the influences of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Johann Henrik Pestalozzi, and Frederick Froebel, and their call for a newer, better education for children. Kindergarten to this day is a very influential grade where teachers start forming the building blocks of education while keeping their minds and bodies active throughout the day. Referring to the mission of the progressive education movement, we still use most of those values in our schools today. In summary, many changes happened during the progressive era. The country started reforming after the Gilded Era, with the influence of some of America's titans of industry. More jobs were being created. However, many children filled positions as there were still no child labor laws. Officials slowly started to recognize that children needed to be in school more than in a factory or on the family farm, that they needed a solid education. though numbers still did not rise until after the turn of the century. In 1880, the National Association for the Deaf was founded. Then, in 1892, the National Education Association was founded. By 1919, the Progressive Education Association was formed, and all states made laws for transporting students to school. Thank you for watching our presentation.